What did Thomas Pynchon think of Don Delillo? And today we are going to hear Pynchon's thoughts on Delillo's greatness. And then when we're done exploring that, we will hear Delillo's thoughts on Pynchon. And this is such a fun opportunity because both of these men are reclusive. Pynchon obviously being one of the most reclusive authors of the past century, but Delillo doesn't do many events and many interviews either. And so I love that we get this cross-pollination because both of these men are also some of the best writers out of New York City ever. And Right Conscious is the headquarters of everything related to Thomas Pynchon and Don Delillo here on YouTube. We talk about the best books and authors of all time. And obviously, these two are a part of that group. And so if you look at the playlist down below, you will find many videos on both of these authors. And those playlists are going to expand over time because I plan to make hundreds of videos on these guys over the next couple years. And so the context of our quote from Pynchon is that he is writing a blurb for Mao 2 by Don DeLillo. But what makes this very unique is that Mao 2 is a novel about a reclusive author named Bill Gray, a hardcore literary fiction author that was raised in New York City and eventually fled to the country, or I should say the countryside. And we recently just read Mao 2 this past Saturday, or at least discussed it in my Right Conscious book club. And what was interesting is that many people read the book, but I would say half of the people didn't really like it or understand it. And if you go check the Goodreads score, this isn't, I think it's like a 3.7 or something, which doesn't necessarily matter. But what I've found about this book is that it's an absolute maze. It is complex. It is in the Pynchon spirit. And it really deals with this idea of reclusivity and what is art. And how do you handle the pressure of being an artist? I know that David Foster Wallace wrote an entire essay on some of the metaphors on art that DeLillo uses in Mao 2. And actually, him and DeLillo had a correspondence in letters over it. And I know multiple authors who are very good who also hold this novel in high regard. And so I just wanted to kind of set that up before we go further, before we hear from Pynchon, because it's somewhat of a short quote, but with this context, I think it will make more sense. And so Pynchon says, quote, "This novel's a beauty, a vision as bold and a voice as eloquent and morally focused as any in American writing." And this quote is somewhat wild because the word that struck me immediately when I saw this was morally focused. Because when I think of Pynchon, I don't think of him being this kind of moral beacon for American society necessarily. But upon further reflection, when us beginning authors or intermediate authors or even advanced authors, and then all the readers think of how authors work, we don't take into account the generational talent that people like Pynchon, DeLillo, and McCarthy have. Because if you and I set out right now to, let's say, write a novel with a moral focus or a theme, most likely because we are not super advanced yet, we would take away from the actual story by trying to inject the theme. Because most people at the start of their career, and sometimes forever, cannot actually write about a certain theme unless it just kind of comes naturally to the story. They catch this big fish, and then the novel manifests into something. And then once it's turned into that, you can be like, okay, this is kind of the theme and the big thing, and we can kind of make some enhancements. But it was never really up to you. But at some point, you reach a certain level of talent that kind of the fall off that occurs when you choose to focus on a theme doesn't matter because you're already so good. So it's already just made up for. So that's something that modern authors and artists can do that many of us don't think is possible, is say, I'm going to consciously create art about this. And what's insane about that is that I believe that that's the highest form of art, this morally focused art, whether it's malignant aspects of consciousness or positive, because I know that when I create art a lot of the time, it falls more on the negative side. And that's the same for everyone. We've been programmed with tragedy, with this idea of what art should be. And breaking free from that is really hard. And so if we just intuitively catch the big fish and do what we think we should do, most of the time, it's actually not going to be a positive or transformative force for society, except in negation, like, oh, this is not how you should be. And this is an exploration of the dark side of consciousness and blah, blah, blah. We already have enough of that. And so what's crazy is that I feel like many of these authors behind me reached a level, Dostoevsky being one of them, who could just start saying, this is what I'm going to do. And so what Pynchon is saying about Mao 2 right here to kick things off is that this is a novel about writing a novel, about an author, Bill Gray, who's reclusive and can't figure out how to write this novel. And as you guys know, anything that is metafictional starts to get weird, or, meta about its art form. Like, it's a movie about a movie. And sometimes if it's like Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain, where we kind of get the reveal at the end, it's all a movie. It works because if you break the fourth wall and just kind of end it, David Lynch does this sometimes, then it's all good because, you're mind blown and then you leave the theater or the book ends. But if you break the fourth wall and start getting metafictional right at the start, which happens in Mao 2, like within the first 40 pages, the wall's broken. And Don DeLillo is basically writing about himself. He called himself Bill Gray. He said, I want to change my identity, be called Bill Gray, and just disappear from the world, which is what happens in this book. So there's this metafictional aspect to it about the craft that Pynchon and DeLillo are in. And that takes away already from some of the power of the work. But what DeLillo is exploring also in this novel, and there's like so many different themes going on here, you guys. Like, there's so much contrast and interplay in this that, like, now that I've read it for the third time, I'm like, holy shit. But something that he's writing about, which I think Pynchon resonated with, is what happens after you've had your big artistic push, after you've written Gravity's Rainbow and Underworld and White Noise and all these novels. What happens in the second wind? And I don't know if you guys know about Mao Zedong, but he did this big swim, I think, when he was 71 years old, and the media made it this big deal. And then he went and took over the party again and ruled for 9 years because they thought that he was done for. They thought that he didn't have any exuberance or chi left in him. And that's what's kind of happening here. As you start to age as an artist, can you still do it? Can you still write these masterpieces? And what layers this? So that idea, you may be like, okay, well, Ian, that's not very deep. But DeLillo, had a premonition, an idea of what was going to happen to our society. One of the major themes in this novel is the relation between the novelist and the terrorist, because DeLillo says that, and through Bill Gray, that the novel is going to die because of terrorism, because novelists are supposed to be these moral beacons, these truth tellers, these people that bring this reality to the world, bring truth to the world. That's our job through the long form of the novel, because TV shows and movies can't go as deep as a novel. A 500,000 word novel like Gravity's Rainbow, White Noise, Underworld, Infinite Jest can go much deeper than even 5 or 6 seasons of The Wire or The Sopranos. And so what happens, though, is that terrorism is fully illogical. It has, and DeLillo says in Mao 2, or writes, there's a curious knot that binds novelists and terrorists. Years ago, I used to think it was possible for a novelist to alter the inner life of the culture. Now, bomb makers and gunmen have taken that territory. They make raids on human consciousness. What writers used to do before, we were all incorporated. And, I love that there used to be raids on human consciousness, that a book would come out or a piece of art, and it would shake things up. That doesn't exist anymore. We don't have authors who are necessarily doing that. We look back to some of these older books, but who does that now? It's terrorists. It's 9/11. It's, Israel and Iran. It's those conflicts. Those are our grand narratives. That's what shakes us. That's what people talk about. That's what forms our morality. Are you for bombing Gaza? No, then that means you support Hamas terrorists, and then you're anti-Zionist, you want the Jews to die. Like, our moral questions surround terrorism in the Middle East because it's entirely illogical. There is no solution. The people, both sides over there, if applied to different nations and different situations, we'd be like, what the hell? And so the truth and our morals have been stretched so far over there that novelists don't matter anymore. And I think Pynchon started to see that happen, that they probably were very idealistic, like all of us are when they were young and wanting to be writers, and they thought, I'm going to change the world. And then they did. They started writing masterpieces that did start to impact culture. But then they said, when things continue to get worse, then what's my duty here? And that's what Mao 2 is about this revival, about Bill Gray and his second wind. And I think that Delillo and Pynchon, who were at the later, Pynchon especially, who was at the later stage of his life back in the early 1990s, resonated with this. And I would just recommend reading this. We read books like this in the Right Conscious Book Club all the time. We are also reading through all of Thomas Pynchon's books in the Right Conscious Book Club. This Saturday, we are reading and discussing Bleeding Edge by Thomas Pynchon, and we are preparing for Thomas Pynchon's new novel, Shadow Ticket, which comes out October 7th, in which we will also be reading together as a group. And so if you guys are interested in joining my Right Conscious Book Club and getting access to a ton of my other literature courses and writing courses, there is a link down below that you guys can go check out. I also have a ton of free content over on Substack, and Substack is the home of the literary renaissance, and all readers and writers should be on there anyway. And so now that we've heard from Pynchon, let us now hear Delillo's thoughts on Pynchon. Quote, somebody quoted Norma Mailer as saying that he wasn't a better writer because his contemporaries weren't better. I don't know whether he really said that or not, but the point I want to make is that no one in Pynchon's generation can make that statement. If we are not as good as we should be, it's not because there isn't a standard. And I think Pynchon, more than any other writer, has set the standard. He's raised the stakes. And this is 100% true, that when you look at people like Delillo and Wallace and many others, they had to be raised up by Pynchon. And as I've discussed before, Pynchon is the boogeyman of Western literature. Pynchon, I think, kicked off the kind of minimalism push that started to happen in the 80s because everyone realized we can't write like this. We're not this smart. We're not this good. We have to do this minimalism and turn this into an art form. And the same is true with everyone who had to cope with the fact that there was this reclusive author out there. And the same is true today because he's still alive and we're still writing and trying to stand on his shoulders, that we have to put ourselves out there, that there is most likely going to be never an opportunity for us or for any of us to just be totally reclusive and be able to sell millions of books, over 10 million books. And the only way for many of us to be read by anyone is to market ourselves, to be the exact opposite of Pynchon, which is a mindfuck, because all of us want to be able to say, I just am this artist, I'm this Tolstoyan, Pynchonian man who just writes and doesn't care about the reader, doesn't care about anyone, and yada, yada, yada. And what sucks is that we have to take the harder path. Many of you guys, and this is where I was, don't want to put yourself online and market and do anything because it requires you to make a character leap. But that is the universe. That is syntropy. That is the evolution of writing, that us writers must change, that filmmakers and musicians and artists and other people have had to evolve, not just in their skills in their chosen medium, but as human beings themselves. And that's why I really appreciate Pynchon's quote about being morally focused. And that's why I appreciate this discussion, because Don DeLillo and Thomas Pynchon and the other greats behind me aren't just creating art for art's sake. They're not just saying, this is my intuition, this is why I want to write. They are worried about the reader. They are, during revision, consciously thinking, I want to make this better. I want people to react a certain way. They are masters of psychology. And to do that means that you have to be of the world, unless you're just this uber generational talent. You have to be in the world to understand the world so that you can write the world. And so I agree with DeLillo. These are the people whose shoulders we need to stand on. And I'm excited to read anyone out there who feels like they can do it and are doing it. But the only way I will know about you is not if you email me, but if you put your work out there and everyone starts to talk about it. Have you read Johnny Silver's new book yet? No. What's that about? That's how you will get out there to the world. And so my wife's over there laughing. John Silver, yeah. The guy from Treasure Island. So funny, man. Black Sails is still circulating in my head a little bit. All right, everyone. So that's how I'm going to know. Thank you guys for being here, and I will see you guys very soon in the next video.